Coming in at number 10 is Nikolai Yezhof. Nikolai Yezhof was a Soviet secret police officer including at the height of the Great Purge. He organized mass arrests, tormented, and executions, but then he fell from Stalin's good graces. He was arrested and subsequently admitting in a confession to a range of anti-Soviet activity, including unfounded arrests during the Purge. He was executed in 1940 along with others who were blamed for the Purge. Now Nikolai wasn't only ousted, executed, and disgraced along with his family, he was then methodically erased from photographs where he had previously appeared with his commander. Overnight, Nikolai went from one of the highest officers in a powerful New World Order to a shadow in a poorly lit photo and a name no one dared to utter. Now, Nikolai wasn't the only person to receive this Photoshop treatment, as it was common in the communist government to deny failures and make inconvenient truths, even people, disappear. Now, the practice has continued in current communist-led governments where rebellious leaders are removed by force and deleted from official documents. Coming in at number 9 is Delphine Lalaurie. Delphine Lalaurie was a sadistic serial slayer socialite who lived in New Orleans. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out in her mansion's kitchen, and firefighters found a 70-year-old black woman chained to the stove. Now, she appeared to have started the fire in order to attract outside attention while Delphine was trying to save her furniture. Now, the authorities were led by other slaves to the attic, and they were shocked. Disfigured and maimed slaves were chained to the walls or floors. Several had been subjects to medical experiments, most likely performed by her husband, who was a doctor. One man appeared to be part of some bizarre change. A woman was trapped in a small cage with her limbs broken and reset to look like a crab, and another woman with arms and legs removed and patches of her flesh sliced off in a circular motion to resemble a caterpillar. There were claims that an elderly man had his face so beaten it was indistinguishable, and one woman had her back wounded to the point where her bones were visible. Some had their mouths sewn shut and starved to death, others had their hands sewn to different body parts, and most were found dead, and the remaining that were alive were begging to die to be released from the unbearable pain. Now, Lalaurie and her husband fled by boat before she could be brought to justice, leaving the butler, who also participated, to face the wrath of a mob that had gathered outside. Number 8. Zhang Qing. Zhang Qing was a Chinese communist revolutionary, actress, and major political figure during the Cultural Revolution. She was the fourth wife of Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Communist Party and paramount leader of China. Now, Zhang was best known for playing a major role in the Cultural Revolution and forming the radical political alliance known as the Gang of Four. Through clever maneuvering, she managed to reach the highest position of power within the Communist Party, just short of being president. It is believed that she was the main driving force behind China's Cultural Revolution, of which she was the deputy director. Now, during the Cultural Revolution, much economic activity was halted, and countless ancient buildings, artifacts, antiques, books, and paintings were destroyed by Red Guards. Millions of people in China reportedly had their human rights annulled during this time, and millions more were also forcibly displaced. Estimates of the death toll of civilians and Red Guards from various Western and Eastern sources are about 500,000 in the true years of chaos of 1966 to 1969, but some estimate as high as 3 million deaths, with 36 million being prosecuted. Number 7. Jang Song-taek. Jang Song-taek was the uncle of the current dictator of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. He was more focused on following in the ways of his brother, Kim Jong-il, something that the new dictator didn't agree with. Now, at the beginning of his rule, Kim Jong-un was still considered quite young for his political position, and some of his choices were questionable at best. Seeing that his uncle didn't agree with him, he had him tried by a special military tribunal and executed by a firing squad. Now, after his execution, Kim ordered all media outlets within North Korea to remove any sort of record of him, and that included any sort of pictures or information from history books. Number 6. Peter Burnett. Peter Burnett was an American politician who served as the first elected governor of California from December 20th, 1849 to January 9th, 1851. Now, in 1848, he moved to California during the height of the California Gold Rush. He was appointed to serve on the Supreme Court of California, and even though he had enslaved 2 people, to make California a slave state, instead pushing for a total exclusion of African Americans in California. Governor Peter signed into the law the so-called Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which enabled the enslavement of native Californians and contributed to their genocide. He declared in an 1851 speech that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate the results, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power and wisdom of man to avert. Now, efforts by federal negotiators to preserve some native land rights were fought by the administration of Pedro, who favored the elimination of California's indigenous peoples. Now, he also passed the Foreign Miners Act, which taxed only Chinese and Mexicans, deliberately designed to drive them out of the gold fields. Now, a wave of violence against them took place before and after. Number 5. H.H. Holmes. H.H. Holmes was a con artist who liked to take the lives of people. Until his execution in 1896, he chose a career of crime, including insurance fraud, 3 to 4 illegal marriages, horse theft, and ending the lives of many. He claimed to have ended the lives of 27 people before he was arrested, tried, and executed. He constructed a hotel of horrors, later known as the Murder Castle, to target guests visiting the Windy City during the 1893 World Fair. Now, the building was equipped with soundproof rooms and had gas lines that could be used to asphyxiate guests. It also had trap doors and a secret series of tunnels that Holmes could use to spirit away their bodies, which he was believed to have dissected and sold. Now, in the basement were a dissecting table, stretching rack, and industrial oven. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was executed, and in 2017, amid allegations that Holmes had in fact escaped execution, his body was exhumed for testing. Due to his coffin being contained in cement, his body was found not to have decomposed normally. His clothes were almost perfectly preserved, and his mustache was found to be intact. Now, his body was positively identified by his teeth as being that of Holmes, and he was then reburied. Number 4. Ante Pavelic. Ante Pavelic was a Croatian politician who founded and headed the fascist ultranationalist organization known as the Ustashi in 1929 and served as a dictator of the independent state of Croatia, also known as the NDH. Ante and the Ustashi prosecuted many racial minorities and political opponents in the NDH during the war, including Serbians, Jewish and Roma people, and anti-fascists, becoming one of the key figures side of Serbians. At the behest of the German senior Ustaše Slavo Kosmic declared the NDH's establishment on April 10, 1941 in the name of Ante. Ante then returned from Italy and took control of the puppet government. He created a political system similar to that of fascist Italy and Germany. After taking control, Ante imposed largely anti-Serbian and anti-Semitic policies that resulted in the deaths of over 100,000 Serbians and Jewish people in concentration and extermination camps in the NDH, which resulted in the torment and deaths of several 100,000 Serbians, along with tens of thousands of Roma and Jewish people. Now, following the surrender of Germany in May 1945, he fled, and ironically, on April 10, 1957, a Serbian hotel owner attempted to end his life by shooting him. Now, initially surviving, the resulting injuries would lead to his death on December 28, 1959. Number 3. General Yahya Khan. General Yahya Khan was a Pakistani military officer who served as the 3rd president of Pakistan from 1969 to 1971. Now, he also served as the commander-in-chief of the Pakistan Army from 1966 to 1971. Now, along with Tika Khan, he is considered the chief architect of the 1971 Bangladesh genocide. Yahya Khan's presidency oversaw marital law by suspending the constitution in 1969. Holding the country's first general election in 1970, he delayed the power of transition, and in March 1971, Khan ordered Operation Searchlight in an effort to suppress Bengali nationalism. This led to the Bangladesh Liberation War in March 1971. Now, Khan was central to the perpetration of Bangladesh genocide, in which around 300,000 to 3 million Bengalis died, and between 200,000 to 400,000 women were taken advantage of. In December 1971, Pakistan carried out preemptive strikes against the Bengali allied Indian Army, culminating the start of the Third Indian-Pakistan War. Now, the wars resulted in the surrender of Pakistan, and East Pakistan seceded as Bangladesh. After Pakistan's surrender, Khan resigned from the military command and transferred the presidency. Khan's short regime is regarded as the leading cause of the breakup of Pakistan. He is viewed negatively in both Bangladesh, being considered the chief architect of genocide, and in Pakistan. Number 2. Pol Pot. Pol Pot was a Cambodian revolutionary, dictator, and politician who ruled Cambodia as the Prime Minister of Democrat Kampuchea between 1976 and 1979. He was a leading member of Cambodia's communist movement, the Khmer Rouge, from 1963 to 1997 and served as General Secretary of the Communist Party of Kampuchea from 1963 to 1981. Now, his administration converted Cambodia into a one-party communist state and perpetrated the Cambodian genocide. Pot planned to turn Cambodia into a simple, agrarian, and socialist society. He forced the urban population, such as teachers, doctors, and other professionals, into the countryside, onto collective farms, and executed anyone who complained or broke rules by a pickaxe. There was more than 150 detention centers for any dissidents. S-21, the most notorious one, had 7 survivors out of 20,000. Others were taken to fields, executed, and buried in mass graves. Now, he also outlawed religion, most reading, money, anything private, and strictly governed sexual relations, vocabulary, and clothing. Out of a country of not even 10 million people, it's estimated up to 3 million people died in just 3 years. Number 1. Queen Ravaloa. Queen Ravaloa was known as the Mad Queen of Madagascar, and I feel like that explains a lot. She finally ascended to the throne on August 4th, 1829, where she immediately took out all her rivals. She had expelled the European merchants, teachers, diplomats, and trade deals with Britain and France were immediately cancelled. After one successful battle against an invasion, she slit the heads of Europeans, stuck them on pikes, and lined them in the beaches. Now, she also banned the teachings of Christianity, and she had many evil techniques to punish people, as her descendants and criminals would be dumped slowly in boiling water or oil, or tied down with ropes and burned alive. She would place others into coffins, and some were buried into holes with dirt showered upon them. She sold her subjects into slavery to boost her country's economy, which involved brutal labor conditions, staying far away from homes, and malnutrition-related deaths. Now, these people were either considered traitors, victims of war, non-taxpayers, or Christians who secretly practiced their religion. Her reign brought down the nation's population from 5 million to 2.5 million at the end of her rule.
And we're starting things off with Alan Leger, aka the Monster of Miramichi. Born in 1948 in New Brunswick, this guy committed a robbery with 2 accomplices in 1986 that resulted in the brutal beating of both of the owners, who were an elderly couple, one of which, the husband, John Glending, did not survive. The trio were arrested, and Leger began serving time at the Atlantic Institution Maximum Security Penitentiary. In 1989, he was transported to a hospital due to an ear infection, and it was there that he would make his escape. He pleaded with the guards to allow him to go to the washroom alone, and somehow he managed to get them to agree. Once he was inside the bathroom, he pulled out the small sharpened piece of metal he'd hidden up his rear, and picked the lock to his handcuffs. He fled from the hospital, and through a series of carjackings managed to avoid being captured for 7 whole months. And he didn't lay low during this time either. He took the lives of 4 more people in completely random attacks. He burnt a victim's home down with 2 sisters inside, attacked another woman, Annie Flam, and her sister. This sister managed to make it out alive, and he took the life of Reverend Father James Smith. He was finally arrested again though, and remains in prison till this day. Number 9. Nikolai Yezhof, aka Metal Fang. Nikolai took the lives of at least 5 women, engaging in brutal acts of violence that shocked the nation. He would then consume some of the body parts of his victims. His crimes earned him the nickname Metal Fang due to the dental work he used to bite his victims. He'd lost some of his teeth in a fight when he was younger, being fitted with metal dentures. In 1979, he was finally captured and sent to a mental hospital. He was released in just less than a year though, and guess what? He took the lives of 3 more victims, the last of which was actually a friend of his. He invited some friends over for a dinner party, and at one point, guests found him in the next room, having crouched next to his friend, eating him. He would spend 8 years in a treatment center, but while being transported to another facility in 1989, he managed to escape. He managed to stay hidden for years, living in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan. He likely would have been found if it weren't for the fact that he got tired of this life and basically turned himself in. He remains housed in a specialized psychiatric clinic to this day. Next on the list is Gonzalo Lopez. Lopez was a convicted criminal with multiple life sentences. He made his escape from prison in May 2022, serving life terms for taking the life of Jose Ramirez in 2006 and the shooting of 2 police officers. Lopez saw an opportunity during a hospital transfer. While being transported with 15 other inmates, he seized the moment, stabbing the corrections officer before making off with the vehicle. Police shot the tires, but he managed to drive for another mile before crashing it and then fleeing into the forest. Lopez remained a fugitive, managing to evade law enforcement for several weeks. Tragically, on June 2nd, he resurfaced at a family ranch in Centerville, Texas, where he committed a horrific act, resulting in the deaths of 5 individuals, 66-year-old Mark Collins and his 4 grandchildren. The manhunt for Lopez intensified, and later that same day, a shootout between Lopez and the police broke out. In the end, Lopez got what he deserved, and no officers were harmed. Number 7, the Texas 7. Texas 7 was a group of 7 convicts who pulled off a prison escape in December of 2000. These inmates, serving sentences for various crimes, were all going to be in prison for a long time, and feeling like they had nothing to lose, they planned an escape. They managed to overpower and subdue prison employees at the John B. Connolly unit in Kennedy, Texas. Using stolen weapons and clothing, they took advantage of a maintenance truck's cover and made their getaway. Their escape set off a massive manhunt across Texas. The group was on the run for over a month, committing a series of robberies and other crimes to help sustain themselves. They even took the life of a police officer during a robbery. The Texas 7's run came to an end, though, on January 22nd, 2001 in Woodland Park, Colorado, when a tip led authorities to their hideout. There'd been an episode, I believe, I can't remember the show, Unsolved Mysteries or something, where they showed them and like a bunch of people phoned in being like, I think I've seen those guys. Anyway, there was a standoff with law enforcement. One member took his own life and the rest were apprehended. The majority of them are now on death row. Next up, we have Sharon Kinney. Unlike most of the criminals on this list, Sharon has still yet to be found. Suspected of being responsible for the deaths of 3 individuals, including her husband, James, and the wife of a boyfriend in 1960, Kinney's actions led to a series of trials. She faced 3 unsuccessful attempts at prosecution for the death of her husband. As the 4th trial loomed, Kinney made a bold move and fled off to Mexico to evade justice. And while in Mexico, she became involved in yet another deadly encounter, claiming self-defense when she shot and killed a man. But Mexican authorities, they just weren't buying it, and she ended up being convicted, landing her in Mexican prison with a 13-year sentence. On December 7th, 1969, just 4 years into her sentence, she capitalized on the facility's lax security measures. There was also a prison blackout, which helped, and she ended up making her escape, slipping away into the night, never to be seen again. To this day, Sharon Kinney remains at large, holding one of the longest outstanding warrants in American history. At our number 5 spot, Richard Matt and David Sweat were 2 dangerous inmates who pulled off a daring escape from Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York in 2015. These criminals used cunning and tools to cut through steel walls and pipes within their cells, and over a period of months they created this series of tunnels and passages within the prison's walls, leading to the catwalks and utility tunnels. On the night of June 6, 2015, Matt and Sweat made their move. They crawled through the labyrinth of passages they'd made, emerging through a manhole cover outside the prison's walls. Of course, a manhunt was launched, with law enforcement across the state and beyond joining in on the hunt. They managed to evade capture for a number of weeks, robbing cabins and seeking refuge in the wilderness. Richard Matt lost his life at the hands of law enforcement on June 26th. And David Sweat was captured again 2 days later, weakened and suffering from gunshot wounds. Next on the list is Donald Leroy Evans. This guy was an absolute despicable prick. He took the lives of multiple people between 1985 and 1991. The true extent of these crimes I can't get into. He did more than just strangle people to death, though. He would usually attack his victims at rest stops and public parks, and even though he was initially only connected to 3 cases, he later admitted to being responsible for the unsolved deaths of 70 other people across 22 states. In June of 1993, while in custody at Harrison County Jail, he managed to escape along with 3 other inmates. Luckily, it didn't take the cops long to find him. He had been hiding out in a shed. Evans ended up getting the death penalty, but his death would come much quicker than it likely would have. Thankfully, he was stabbed in the shower by a fellow death row inmate in 1999. And at number 3, Alexander Solonik, nicknamed Russian Jackal and Alexander the Great. This guy was a Russian mob hitman and was damn good at his job. He was also really good at escaping from prison apparently, which he did a number of times. The long arm of justice had finally caught up with him and he was arrested, but he managed to escape out of the courthouse window, fleeing to Siberia. He was caught and arrested again, spending 2 years in jail before escaping through the ventilation system. He went back to working as a hitman, but after a shootout in 1995, he was arrested once again in Moscow. The mob managed to bribe a guard to help him escape this time, and he exited his cell, scaling the wall with help of a rope and some climbing gear, and then entered into a waiting BMW. He headed to Greece, where he intended to spend the rest of his days, I guess, and that's exactly what happened, only he didn't live as long as he wanted or expected to. The mob wanted to tie up any loose ends and enlisted one of Solonik's very own friends, a fellow hitman, to take him out. This guy sounds like the real-life John Wick or something. Next on the list we have James Earl Ray. Ray, who was serving a 99-year prison sentence for killing civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., managed to escape from prison for a second time on August 7th of 1997. This escape occurred at the Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Tennessee. Ray and 6 other inmates managed to escape, but their freedom was short-lived as law enforcement launched a massive manhunt, and just 3 days later, on June 13th, he was recaptured in a wooded area about 8 miles from the prison. His second escape was not as successful as his first. Had also been in prison for something else before that incident and managed to escape for months or something like that. Ultimately, though, led to tighter security measures in the prison system, and Ray would spend the rest of his life behind bars, dying in prison in 1998. Finally, though, at number 1, we have Ted Bundy. If you want to talk about one of the most notorious criminals in American history, this guy was definitely one of them. Managed to escape authorities on 2 separate occasions. In 1977, Ted Bundy pulled off 2 daring escapes from custody. The first escape took place in Aspen, where he was awaiting trial. Bundy decided to represent himself in court, which gave him access to the law library at Pickens County Courthouse. And on June 7th, he made his move. Unshackled and unguarded, he jumped out of a 2nd-floor window of the courthouse. Took authorities 6 days to catch him again. The second escape happened later that same year, on December 30th. While he was incarcerated, Bundy managed to carve a hole in the ceiling of his cell. Through his makeshift tunnel, he crawled to freedom. Not only was this guy a truly evil human being, but he was cunning and resourceful on top of it. Not a good combination. Good for him, but not good for everyone else. And we're starting out this list with Grigory Rasputin. Born in 1869 in a small Siberian village, he grew up as a peasant. He was also a mystic and grew up to become quite close with the Russian royal family after seemingly healed Alexei Nikolaevich, the son of Nicholas II and heir to the Russian throne. Alexei was a hemophiliac, meaning his blood didn't clot properly, and Rasputin, after being called to the palace of Nicholas and Alexandra, seemed to ease his symptoms. This was miraculous, and the royal family put their full trust in this mysterious holy man who would go on to have sleeping with any woman he could within the palace, but he was also known to force himself on women. But because Nicholas and Alexandra were so enamored with his supposed power, any concern or report about him was completely written off. It seemed that everyone on the outside wanted the guy gone, though, seeing how he was pulling Nicholas and Alexandra's strings, controlling them like puppets, and there were a number of attempts to take Rasputin's life, but this guy was hard to take down. He was stabbed and recovered, poisoned with cyanide, which had no effect. He was shot and was seemingly dead before springing up like Michael Myers at the end of Halloween. He was then shot again before being wrapped up in a blanket and thrown in a river where he finally drowned. Number 9. Gilles de Rais. Born in 1404, Gilles de Rais was a French nobleman and a respected military leader, but he had a secret life. He was responsible for viciously taking the lives of countless young ones and was said to be a practitioner of black magic and conducted occult rituals, leading many to believe that he possessed otherworldly abilities. This guy was an absolute monster. If you want to talk about true evil, this is it right here. His servants, mostly young men, very young men, and other young ones around his castles, started going missing, and rumors started to spread that Gilles de Rais was disposing of them, something that turned out to be true when witnesses began seeing servants disposing of bodies. Many were afraid to speak out against him, though, due to the immense gap in class that was present at the time. He was finally arrested in 1440, though, and under the threat of excruciating punishment, he admitted to his crimes, actually revealing that he would take the lives of his victims in these dark, occult-like rituals. Next on the list, we have Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory, born August 7th, 1560, was a Hungarian noblewoman notorious for being one of the most prolific female serial killers in history. She's often remembered as the Blood Countess because of her horrifying crimes. Bathory was accused of tormenting and taking the lives of numerous young females. Her methods included severe beatings, burning, and disfigurement. And what she's most famous for, though, was her belief that bathing in her victim's blood would preserve her youth. It's said that she may have taken the lives of hundreds in her quest for eternal beauty. Her actions eventually caught the attention of authorities. In 1610, she was arrested and her accomplices were put on trial, and the accounts from witnesses and survivors painted a very chilling picture of her cruelty. She was never officially tried in court, but was confined to a windowless room in her castle until her death in 1614. Number 7. Aleister Crowley. Crowley, born in 1875, was an English occultist and ceremonial magician, founded the religion of Thelema. He was a prominent and very controversial guy, especially at the time, known as the Great Beast 666. He was an occultist, writer, and ceremonial magician, a man of many mysteries and oddities. Crowley was known for more than just his eccentric lifestyle, though. One of the big questions surrounding him is whether he actually had any mystical powers or was just really good at talking the talk. Crowley wasn't shy about bragging that he could communicate with supernatural beings. He claimed to have a direct line to a being named Aiwass, who supposedly dictated to him the book of the law, basically the Bible of Thelema. Then there's the curious case of his rituals. Crowley was all about strange ceremonies, often involving weird symbols and chants, and even some bizarre sexual practices. As to whether he was evil, I mean, some would definitely say he was, but yeah, certainly not like most of the others on this list. Like this next guy, for example. And at number 6, Thug Behram. Thug Behram, born in 1765, became infamous as the ruthless leader of the Thuggee cult in India during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Thuggee were a secret criminal society that specialized in robbery and murder, targeting unsuspecting travelers. What made the Thuggee particularly sinister was their method of operation. They would often befriend and gain the trust of their victims on the road, only to then strangle them with a rummel, a cloth, and this kind of ritualistic fashion, allowing them to carry out their crimes discreetly. Behram was one of the most notorious Thuggee leaders, believed to have taken the lives of hundreds. He actually admitted to witnessing 931 people die right in front of him, and that's not even counting the ones he had a direct hand in. Under his leadership, the thugs terrorized India for years with a well-organized network that spanned the country. He was eventually captured and put to death in 1840. Next, we have H.H. Holmes. Holmes was born in 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. Although he was highly intelligent from a young age, he displayed all your classic disturbing signs early on. He would capture and torture animals, cutting into them and performing strange experiments. Holmes, whose real name was Herman Webster Mudgett, not quite as intimidating sounding, committed crimes that were as horrifying as they were calculated. He constructed this nightmarish castle in Chicago, specifically equipped with secret passageways and soundproof rooms and gas chambers, which were all made to assist with his gruesome crimes. He would lure numerous victims, mostly young women, surprise, surprise, into his property, and once inside, they came face to face with unimaginable horrors, including excruciating torment, asphyxiation, and dissection. The exact number of his victims isn't 100% known, but it could be anywhere from just 9 to over 200. I'm guessing it's somewhere in between. In 1896, he was finally convicted for his crimes and sentenced to death. Number 4, Gil Garnier. Here we have a real-life werewolf case, at least the closest thing possible. Gil Garnier, aka the Hermit of Saint Benoît and the Werewolf of Dole, was a reclusive man born at some point in the mid-1500s in France. He lived in an isolated home just outside the town of Dole. His new wife moved out to the home with him, and it was at this point that something changed in Garnier. He had always hunted food for himself, but now having to provide for another person, it was difficult, and this started driving a wedge between him and his wife, and he started getting desperate. It was at this point that several young ones in the area started being found mauled to death with parts of their bodies having been eaten. Meaning this had to have been the work of some large animal, right? But it wasn't. It was Garnier. Garnier's crimes came to light when a group of traveling workers had spotted him eating the body of one of his victims in the dead of night. At first, they thought they were looking at a wolf. According to Garnier, he had been hunting one night when a ghostly figure came to him, telling him it would imbue him with the power to transform into a wolf, making it easier for him to hunt. And since that night, he had stalked and hunted a number of young people, most of which died as a result of his savage attacks. He was burnt at the stake in 1574, accused of lycanthropy and witchcraft. I don't know what it was with guys named Gilles in France back then, but they didn't like young folks, apparently. Number 3, Vlad the Impaler, the original vampire himself. If there's anyone in history that just feels like they stepped out of some portal from another dark dimension, it's this guy. Vlad was born in 1431. He was a tyrant renowned for his brutal methods of punishing enemies, often impaling them on long spikes. His reputation for cruelty gave rise to the legend that is Dracula, inspiring Bram Stoker's famous vampire novel. Alongside these gruesome acts, there are legends suggesting Vlad may have possessed otherworldly powers. Tales kind of hint at his ability to control the weather, summon dark forces, or even transform into a vampire-like creature. The line between fact and fiction often blurs with this guy. Some believe that his cruelty was more than human, that maybe he had something supernatural lurking inside him, some sort of dark entity from beyond. He just inspired this intense fear and awe in his time, and his brutality definitely unquestionable, but the idea of him being an actual vampire, most likely just legend, but fun to imagine. And at number 2, we have Jack the Ripper, a name everyone has heard before. One of the first cases of the type of modern day serial killer we hear about all the time now, only this man was never identified. Jack the Ripper terrorized the Whitechapel district of London in 1888 and remains one of the most infamous figures in criminal history. Victims were taken out in the most gruesome ways possible. They looked like they had been mauled to death by a 500-pound brown bear. Jack primarily targeted female workers of the night, brutally mutilating their bodies. The sheer level of ferocity of these attacks and the fact that he was never caught really has fueled the theories and speculations over the years about him. He taunted the police with letters that were apparently from him, signed as Jack the Ripper. There have been intensive investigations and a number of suspects that have kind of come up over the years that could have been him, but his true identity has never been definitively proven. Finally, we have Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler was a high-ranking German official during World War II. He had a deep and disturbing fascination with the occult. He believed he could summon dark forces to help him shape a new world order and tried to incorporate his beliefs into the ideology of the regime. He established a research institute to explore ancient and supernatural phenomena. Under his direction, he conducted these expeditions to search for evidence of Aryan origins, looking into topics like ancient artifacts, astrology, folklore, and this interest extended to the dark and the occult, as Himmler believed that tapping into these mystical forces would help the German forces gain more power and control. He promoted pseudo-scientific theories, obviously related to racial purity and mysticism, and saw the SS almost as this more modern-day knightly kind of order. Such a bizarre side of the Second World War. It feels like something out of Hellboy, but this really was a thing. The German forces were really dabbling in this type of occult stuff at the time.
Coming in at number 1 is Joseph Mengele. Joseph Mengele was a German officer and physician during World War II. Nicknamed the Angel of Death, he performed deadly experiments on prisoners, where he was a member of the team of doctors who selected victims to die in the gas chambers, and was one of the doctors who administered the gas. One of Joseph's most chilling characteristics was his double-sided facade. He would offer sweets to the young in the camp's kindergarten, then select them as subjects for lethal experimentation. His medical experiments showed no consideration for the victim's health, safety, or physical and emotional suffering. Now, he was particularly interested in identical twins, people with heterochroma iridum, eyes of 2 different colors, dwarfs, and people with physical abnormalities. He conducted forced sterilizations of prisoners, amputated limbs, and injected chemicals in eyeballs, and once sewed Romani twins back to back. After the war, he escaped justice and lived out the rest of his life in Argentina and Paraguay, and he was never held accountable for the atrocious acts he committed. Number 9. Ilya Anovich. Ilya Anovich was a Russian biologist who worked in artificial insemination. Ilya then wanted to get of animals and put it into different species to see what happened. He started off slowly creating a Z-donk from a zebra and a donkey, a rat mouse, a guinea pig mouse, and an antelope and cow. Then in 1910, he told a gathering of zoologists that he thought it could be possible to create a human-ape hybrid, often now referred to as a human Z. Now, his chance finally came after the Russian Revolution of 1917 while working at the Institute Pasteur. It was here in 1924 he was given the opportunity to work on this. In 1926, he and Serge Vonaroff transplanted a human ovary into a chimp before attempting to inseminate her with human sperm. He attempted this 2 more times without success, so he then pitched an alternative approach. Take chimpanzees and implant it into African women without their knowledge or consent. Now, the plan was to pretend that the insemination of a chimpanzee was merely a medical examination, letting them find out months afterwards when they gave birth to an exceptionally hairy and suspiciously good at climbing baby. Yeah. Now, thankfully, the French governor said no to the idea, but Ilya traveled further with 20 apes and was able to convince people to go along with it. 5 women or more volunteered for his experiment. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, no apes survived long enough at the ape nursery, and though he had women, Ilya found himself out of space. Now, before he could ship in more, the Soviet Academy of Sciences heard about his plans to inseminate women in Africa without consent, and all support for the project was taken away. Number 8. Shiro Ishii. Shiro Ishii was a Japanese war criminal, microbiologist, and army medical officer. He was the director of Unit 731, a biological warfare unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. He led the development and application of biological weapons during the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1945, including the bubonic plague attacks of Chinese cities, and planned the Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night biological attack against the United States. Ishii and his colleagues also also engaged in human experimentation, resulting in the deaths of over 10,000 subjects. Experiments led under his command included vivisection of living people, prisoners had limbs amputated and reattached to other parts of their body, some prisoners had parts of their bodies frozen and thawed to study the resulting untreated gangrene, and humans were also used as living test cases for grenades and flamethrowers, and they were injected with strains of diseases disguised as vaccinations to study their effects. Now, for some reason, Ishii was later granted immunity in the International Military Tribunal for the Far East by the United States government in exchange for information and research for the US Biological Warfare Program. Now, Ishii's immunity deal was concluded in 1948, and he was never prosecuted for any war crimes or crimes against humanity, and his exact whereabouts or occupation were unknown. Number 7. Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was a Chinese politician, communist philosopher, military strategist, and revolutionary who was the founder of the People's Republic of China, PRC, which he led as the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party from the establishment of the PRC in 1949 until his death in 1976. Mao sought to protect China from foreign influence and grow China's agricultural and industrial power through a program called the Giant Leap Forward. Now, unfortunately, this initiative was a huge failure that caused widespread famine and economic collapse. Then, Mao's government tried to cover up the failure. Anyone who spoke out against the program was labeled as a right opportunist and would be arrested or have their life ended. In the end, over 45 million people died under his leadership. Now, hey, there's nothing wrong with owning up to your mistakes, and I think that's something Mao should have done instead of trying to just gaslight everyone. Number 6. Elizabeth Báthory. Elizabeth Báthory was a Hungarian noblewoman and alleged serial slayer from the family who owned land in the Kingdom of Hungary, now Slovakia. Elizabeth and 4 of her servants were accused of tormenting and ending the lives of hundreds of girls and women between 1590 and 1610. Her servants were put on trial and convicted, whereas Elizabeth was imprisoned within the castle of Szeged. Michael Farron, a writer, said in 1999 that the accusations against Elizabeth were supported by testimony from more than 300 individuals, some of whom described physical evidence and the presence of mutilated, dead, dying, and imprisoned girls found at the time of her arrest. Now, stories about Elizabeth, though, then quickly became part of national folklore. Legends describing her vampiric tendencies, such as the tale that she bathed in the blood of virgins to retain her youth, were generally recorded years after her death. Number 5. Francisco Macias Nguema. Francisco Macias Nguema is viewed as one of the most brutal dictators in history. Under his rule, Equatorial Guinea was nicknamed Dachu of Africa. According to historians, Francisco may have been a psychopath as he suffered from mental illness and suffered psychological trauma as a child. Now, some of his evil reign is that on Christmas Eve 1969, Francisco had 186 suspected dissidents executed in the National Football Stadium in Malabo as amplifiers were playing Mary Hopkins' song "Those Were the Days." 150 of the dissidents were shot or hanged, and the others were forced to dig ditches in which they were buried up to their necks and eaten alive by red ants over the next few days. As time went on, Francisco became incredibly paranoid, which included mandating the death of those who wore glasses, banning the use of the word intellectual, and destroying boats to stop his people from fleeing from his rule, and fishing was banned. He was known to order entire villages to die just to eliminate one suspected dissident. His prisons, most importantly Black Beach, were notorious for human rights abuse, as prisoners were humiliated, starved, tormented, and had their lives ended without due process. Number 4. Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold II of Belgium was the second king of the Belgians from 1865 to 1909 and the founder and sole owner of the Congo Free State from 1885 to 1908. Disguised his work and made it seem humanitarian, whereas he had sinister motives and was using forced labor to move Congolese resources. Leopold II took ownership of Congo and treated it like his personal property, as he referred to himself as the proprietor, and in an attempt to govern the people and their land, all sorts of inhuman and unthinkable methods were used. Now, sadly, Congo was looted and exploited for its natural resources, ivory, and rubber. Leopold II was a brutal slave master, and by the time he was done with Congo, the country had lost a lot of its people. Now, otherwise known as the Butcher of the Congo, Leopold II constantly enslaved and exploited the people, and the people were forced to work without pay, and he would amputate the hands of men, women, and the young when the quota of rubber was not met. By the the end of his rule, about half of the population was dead. Number 3. Rafael Trujillo Molina. Rafael Trujillo Molina was a Dominican dictator who ruled the Dominican Republic from August 1930 until his assassination in May 1961. He served as president from 1930 to 1938 and again from 1942 to 1952, ruling for the rest of the time as an unelected military strongman under figurehead presidents. Now, his rule of 31 years is considered one of the bloodiest and most corrupt regimes in the Western Hemisphere and centered around a personality cult of the ruling family. Rafael's security forces were responsible for as many as 50,000 deaths. His domestic policy was built on terror, fear, and total compliance with his will. People called him El Jefe, the chief or the boss, and were utterly obedient towards him and his regime. Resistance was dealt with harshly, and any rebel usually ended up disappearing from the face of the earth. He also hated Haitians, and he ended the lives of every immigrant who was brave enough to speak negatively about the regime and Dominican Republic outside of the country. Almost nobody was safe in their asylum, and no Dominican citizen could leave the country without Rafael's permission. He simply knew everything about everyone and was like a big brother figure. Number 2. Caligula, the third Roman emperor. Ruling the Roman Empire from 37 to 41 AD, Caligula was known to be sadistic, wild, and extravagant. In the first 3 months of his reign, he had 160,000 animals sacrificed. Later, he caught a brain fever, and he was known to be mentally ill, believing he was a god. He felt prisoners should know a very painful death and began to end people's lives by causing them as much pain as possible. Many prisoners were fed to the caged wild panthers, lions, and bears, and if he disliked a gladiator, he would beat them over days until they died. Now, he was known to be so cruel that people would end their own lives rather than face him and his slow, lingering deaths. He also forced husbands to give him their wives, and he himself committed unethical practices with his sisters. And coming at number 1 is Idi Amin. Idi Amin was a Ugandan military officer and politician who served as the 3rd president of Uganda from 1971 to 1979. Now, he ruled as a military dictator and is considered one of the most brutal despots in modern world history. In addition to having his political rivals and government officials taken out, he also turned on ordinary civilians as farmers, students, and even religious figures. Amin would order public executions by firing squad for anyone he felt was plotting against his regime, and even had them televised. He'd have all of his victims' bodies tossed into the Nile, literally creating a bloodbath, and bodies were constantly seen floating down the Nile from Uganda, and at times a dam on Lake Victoria would be so clogged by bodies that it would cause power outages. Now, Amin was also rumored to have kept some of his victims' heads in his refrigerator and eat human body parts. His former health minister, Henry Kebi, said, "On several occasions he told me quite proudly that he had eaten the organs or flesh of his human victims. He was quoted as saying, 'It's not for me, I tried human flesh and it's too salty for my taste.'" Number 10. Peter Kürten. Peter Kürten was a German man known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf who took the lives and took advantage of many people between February and November 1929. The first death he definitely committed occurred on May 25th, 1913. During the course of a burglary, he encountered a girl named Christine Klein asleep in her bed. Peter strangled her, then slashed her twice across the throat with a pocket knife. Now, this made him excited down there, if you know what I mean, due to him hearing the ripping from her wounds onto the floor by her bed and on his hand. He then did this multiple times to countless other victims. Then one day, Peter confessed to his wife that he was the Vampire of Dusseldorf, and in the information provided to detectives, his wife explained that although she had known her husband had been repeatedly imprisoned in the past, she was unaware of his culpability in any deaths. He was arrested and was charged with 9 counts of homicide and 7 of attempted homicide. Now, he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to each of those charges, but he was found guilty and sentenced to death on 9 counts. Now, he was also found guilty of 7 counts of attempted homicide. Now, Peter displayed no emotion as his sentence was passed, and at 6 o'clock on the morning of July 2nd, 1931, Peter was beheaded via guillotine. Since he loved blood, his last words were, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear at the sound of my own gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." Now, that is just disgusting and ew. Number 9. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was the founder and first Khagan of the Mongol Empire, which later became the largest adjoining land empire in history. Having spent the majority of his life uniting the Mongol tribes, he launched a series of military campaigns which conquered large parts of China and Central Asia. In the 13th century, he ended the lives of so many peasants that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were significantly reduced as a result. Now, during his 21-year reign, his destructive armies were responsible for the deaths of up to 40 million people. He died in August of 1227, but his death was kept a closely guarded secret. Now, according to legend, Genghis Khan's last words were, "I have conquered for you a large empire, but my life was too short to take the whole world. That I leave you." Now, whether he uttered those short sentences or not, his successors were more than happy to take up the challenge. Number 8. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer ended the lives of many young men in Milwaukee, where he would then dismember them. It has been reported that he ended the lives of 17 males between 1978 and 1991. A detailed search of his apartment revealed 4 severed heads in his kitchen. A total of 7 skulls, some painted, some bleached, were found in his bedroom and inside a closet. Investigators discovered collected blood drippings upon a tray in the bottom of Jeffrey's refrigerator, plus 2 human hearts and a portion of an arm muscle. In his freezer, investigators discovered an entire torso, plus a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. Elsewhere in the apartment, investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved male sex organs, a mummified scalp, and in a 57-gallon drum, 3 further dismembered torsos dissolving in an acid solution. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberment of his victims were also found, which is just disgusting. Although he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and a psychotic disorder, he was found to be legally sane at his trial. He was convicted of 16 counts of ending someone's life and was to serve 16 terms of life imprisonment on February 17, 1992. Then on November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate. His last words were, "Christ Jesus came to the world to save all sinners, of whom I am the worst." Number 7. Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos was an American serial slayer and prostitute who operated in Florida. In 1989 to 1990, while engaging in street prostitution along highways, she shot and robbed 7 of her male clients. Now, she claimed that her clients had either taken advantage of or tried to take advantage of her, and that all the deaths were committed in self-defense. Eileen was sentenced to death for 6 of the deaths, and on October 9, 2002, after 12 years on Florida's death row, she was executed by lethal injection. Her last words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." Now, that's incredibly unsettling, and I do not like that she said that at all. Number 6. Charles Manson. Charles Manson was a criminal who created a cult called the Manson family. It was active in California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Now, the group consisted of approximately 100 followers who lived an unconventional lifestyle and frequently used psychoactive substances. Now, according to group member Susan Atkins, the members of the family became convinced that Manson was a manifestation of Jesus Christ. Now, some of the members committed a series of 9 deaths at 4 locations in July and August of 1969. In 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree homicide and conspiracy to commit homicide for the deaths of 7 people, including the film actress Sharon Tate. The prosecution contended that while Manson never directly ordered the deaths, his ideology constituted an overt act of conspiracy. Now, on March 4th, 1971, during sentencing hearings, Manson trimmed his beard to a fork and shaved his head, telling the media, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." Then on March 29th, 1971, the jury sentenced him to death. Manson, though, died from cardiac arrest resulting from respiratory failure brought on by colon cancer at a hospital on November 19, 2017. His last words were, "I'm the most famous human being not only that is alive, but the most famous human being that has ever lived." Yeah, you can tell he still had a big ego even while looking into the eyes of death. Number 5. Salvador Ramos. You may not know this man's name, but you do know his crime. On May 24th, 2022, Salvador Ramos and his 66-year-old grandmother had an argument over his failure to graduate from high school, during which he shot her in the face before taking her black 2008 Ford F-150. Ramos, using his Facebook account, sent 3 private messages to a girl from Germany whom he had met online. The first said that he was going to shoot his grandmother, the second said that he had shot his grandmother, and a third, about 15 minutes before the said that he was going to open fire at an elementary school. He went to Robb Elementary School, his former school, and fatally shot 19 students and 2 teachers, while 17 others were injured but survived. Now, details are still fuzzy about what happened, as it took the police forever to get into the building to take Salvador down, but what I could gather is he was in a room and opened the door and said goodnight before officers. In return, the officers back, ending his life. Number 4. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, dubbed the Night Stalker, had a highly publicized home invasion and life-ending spree that terrorized the residents of the greater Los Angeles area and later the San Francisco Bay Area over the course of 14 months. Richard cultivated a strong interest in Satanism and the occult and would often commit burglaries to support his addiction, many of which were later frequently accompanied by ending people's lives and taking advantage of them. Now, he also frequently enjoyed degrading and humiliating his victims, especially those who survived his attacks or whom he explicitly decided to live by forcing them to profess that they loved Satan or telling them to swear on Satan. Now, he was eventually caught, and in 1989 he was convicted of 13 counts of taking someone's life, 5 attempts of taking someone's life, 11 counts of taking advantage of a person, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death and was on death row. While awaiting his scheduled death, he died on June 7th, 2013 due to health complications, but his last words were, "I am beyond good and evil, I will be avenged." All I gotta say is, I hope he doesn't get avenged. Number 3. Albert Fish. Albert Fish ended the lives of many of the young and was suspected in at least 5 homicides. He was nicknamed the Boogeyman for his predatory behavior. He confessed to 3 deaths that police were able to trace to a known homicide, and he confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people. Now, Albert once boasted that his number of victims was about 100. He abducted Grace Budd in 1928, and in an abandoned home in Westchester County, New York, he ended her life and devoured her body. He wrote a letter to Grace's mother telling her about the crimes he committed against her daughter. He said, "When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. How did she kick, bite, and scratch? I then cut her into small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it." Now, this is extremely disturbing, and I cannot imagine how her mother felt, and as a result, he was executed on January 16th, 1936 in the electric chair, and his last words were reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here." Which again is disturbing, because did he really think he didn't deserve to die after the horrible crimes he committed? Number 2. Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was a serial slayer, arsonist, burglar, and someone who took advantage of men. In prison confessions and in his autobiography, he confessed to having committed 21 deaths, only 5 of which could be corroborated. He's suspected of ending the lives of more than 100 men in the United States alone, and several more in Portuguese Angola. He also confessed to having committed more than 1,000 acts of taking advantage of men. His last words were, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 22 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I've committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not the least bit sorry." Now, again, that's just plain disturbing, as he had no remorse at all. And coming at number 1 is Jake Berg. In 1949, Jake Berg, sometimes referred to as the Tacoma Axe Killer, was arrested by police after breaking into the home of Bertha Klutt and her daughter Beverly June Klutt and ending their lives with an axe. Upon questioning by authorities, Jake revealed intimate knowledge of 33 other deaths of Caucasian women, which made him a prime suspect for those as well. On July 15, 1949, Jake was hanged at the Washington State Penitentiary, but not before he uttered what would be later known as the Bird Hex in his final statement. He said, "I'm putting the Jake Bird Hex on all of you who had anything to do with my being punished. Mark my words, you will die before I do." Now, the real scary thing about this is that within a year of his execution, 6 people connected to this case did die. So, is it a curse? Was it a coincidence? Who knows?
And we're starting things off with NXIVM. NXIVM was a secretive self-help organization founded in 1998 by Keith Raniere, initially promoting personal development courses. It eventually devolved into a highly manipulative cult. Not that any cults are really not manipulative, but anyway, Ranieri's leadership tactics were incredibly exploitive, preying on vulnerable individuals seeking personal growth. He established a hierarchical system within the group where women were branded with his initials, and some were coerced into engaging in physically intimate relationships with him. This was labeled as this secret sisterhood of sorts, but it was really just a means of control. Ranieri used deceptive tactics to maintain his power and influence, isolating members from their families and blackmailing them. Many who attempted to leave faced threats and legal battles carried out by the group. In 2019, Ranieri was convicted of his crimes and sentenced to 120 years in prison in 2020. Number 9, the Order of the Solar Temple. This group was founded in 1984 in Geneva by Joseph de Mambro and Luc Jouret. The group took heavy inspiration from the Knights Templar, at least in their appearance, all wearing white robes with red crosses. There was also a heavy amount of secrecy as to what went on in the group, and members had to ascend in the ranks undergoing initiation rites in order to learn the secrets of the group. They also believed that the end of the world was imminent and that the apocalypse would happen at some point in the mid-90s. Just some point. Very safe way of convincing your members of your doomsday prophecy. At some point soon. The group were also taught by their brilliant leaders that life was just an illusion and that the physical body must be shed in order to experience a higher existence on another planet. De Mambro and Jouret ended up convincing several of the members to take their own lives. 53 members, including Jouret and De Mambro, took their own lives at various locations across Switzerland. They were found dead by authorities after remote control devices had ignited fires at the various locations. And then the following year, similar incidents occurred in 2 other locations, France and Canada. Next up, we have Synanon. Chuck E. Dederich founded Synanon in 1958 in Santa Monica, California. Started out as a drug rehabilitation program, although the methods used for care were pretty extreme. The whole idea was quitting cold turkey, which is not a bad thing at all, but in terms of the therapeutic side, members took part in an activity called The Game, where each member would open up about themselves and then receive verbal attacks from all the other members. People also lived at the compound. I feel like if you ever join some kind of religious or self-help kind of group and you're required to stay in a shared living space like indefinitely, it's a good chance you're probably in a cult. Oh, and members were forced to pay large sums of money for membership and perform physical labor. Dederich's methods only got worse though, as he enforced stricter rules on the group and incorporated brainwashing techniques in order to assert his control over them. Eventually, he ordered 2 members to take out a lawyer who was representing one of the members, saying she had been brainwashed and held at the compound against her will. The 2 members put a venomous snake in the lawyer's mailbox, and he nearly died after being bit. Chuck received a very light sentence and a fine, but was chucked out of the cult. Synanon did continue on without him until 1991, though. The Order was an American white supremacist group that was active between September of 1983 and December of 1984. Robert J. Matthews, the leader of the Order, was a fanatical figure with a rather dangerous agenda. He believed in a vision of a white ethno-state and advocated for a race war to achieve this goal. Matthews encouraged his followers to engage in acts of violence against perceived enemies. Under his guidance, the Order carried out a series of criminal activities to fund their operations and further their agenda. This included bank robberies and armored car heists, stolen funds being used to purchase weapons and explosives. The group also targeted individuals they viewed as threats, which included law enforcement officers. The Order's violent actions resulted in the death of radio talk show host Alan Berg, who was just one of many enemies the group had on their hit list. The FBI launched a manhunt to apprehend Matthews and put an end to the Order. In a deadly confrontation at a home in Whidbey Island, Matthews engaged in a shootout with law enforcement after refusing to surrender. The gunfire ignited a fire in the house, taking Matthews down with it. Next up, we have the Church of Euthanasia. Now, this one certainly isn't as evil as the other cults on this list, but it's still pretty extreme. I would not be able to stand hanging out with any of these people. The Church of Euthanasia, founded in Boston, Massachusetts in 1992 by Chris Korda, is a controversial cult known for its extremist views on population control and environmentalism. They've been considered by many as promoting evil ideologies due to the cult's radical stance on reducing the human population through pretty disturbing means. The church advocates for taking one's own life, cannibalism, just a couple of different methods. They set out to achieve their goal of lowering the global population. Now, while the church does claim to use satire to make a point about overpopulation's impact on the environment, their slogan is pretty disgusting, and no, I can't say it on here, nor would I really want to. Next up, we have the narco-Satanists led by Adolfo Constanzo. His group was mostly active in Mexico in the 1980s, revolving around a combination of drug trafficking and occult practices. Constanzo grew up with a mother and stepfather who were both involved in crime. He also had this quote-unquote sorcerer dude who he had apprenticed under, who he would perform ritualistic sacrifices of animals with. Eventually, he gathered a bit of a following of powerful hitmen and drug traffickers. He exerted a strong hold over them, convincing them that he had supernatural powers. And under his influence, the cult engaged in illegal activities, including drug smuggling and violent rituals. Constanzo's evil deeds culminated in a series of these ritualistic murders where innocent victims were brutally sacrificed in an attempt to enhance the cult's powers. Finally, in 1989, law enforcement closed in on the group and Constanzo pulled a machine gun on authorities, leading to a final confrontation before ordering a fellow member to take his life. Number 4, Hanohana Sampaguyo. The Hanohana Sampaguyo cult was a religious group founded in Japan by Hogen Fukunaga. Fukunaga claimed to be the reincarnation of Buddha. Here we go. And convinced his followers that he possessed divine powers. The cult became known for its pretty extreme financial exploitation of the members. Fukunaga convinced his followers to donate significant amounts of money, claiming that doing so would bring them blessings and aid in their spiritual development. He also claimed he could diagnose people by reading their feet and would charge like $900 for these readings. Turns out the guy started the group while he was in tremendous amounts of debt, so he was just a full-on swindler, used car salesman type guy. He knew full well what he was doing. He didn't actually have some deranged belief in his message, and that's what's truly evil about this guy. He amassed some serious wealth through these donations, living a lavish lifestyle while his followers suffered financially. Next up, we have David Koresh's Branch Davidians. The Branch Davidians cult was a religious group that gained attention due to its leader, David Koresh. The story actually begins, though, with Benjamin Rodin, who founded it in 1955. But it was David who later emerged as the prominent figure. He joined the group in the early 80s, claiming to be a prophet and the final messenger of God. His manipulative tactics quickly became evident as he instilled fear and loyalty amongst his followers through strict control and psychological manipulation. He dictated every aspect of their lives, including relationships, daily activities, and inside the cult, he practiced polygamy and engaged in inappropriate relationships with some of his female followers. Can't go into too much detail on that. Common theme amongst these supremely morally superior cult leaders, though. In 1993, the cult's troubles escalated with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or the ATF, who attempted to execute a search warrant on the cult's compound in Waco, Texas. The raid turned into this violent shootout, resulting in the deaths of several agents and cult members. It led to a 51-day standoff between the Branch Davidians and law enforcement. And the standoff ended in absolute disaster when the compound caught fire and the flames just started engulfing all these buildings, resulting in the deaths of 76 Branch Davidians, including the leader David Koresh, or Koresh. Next up, we have Aum Shinrikyo. The Aum Shinrikyo cult was a religious group founded in Japan in 1987 by Shoko Asahara. Initially, the cult kind of presented itself as a spiritual organization with the aim of helping people achieve enlightenment, but as time passed, it became pretty evident that the group had more malevolent intentions. Asahara pulled the strings, manipulating his followers into committing a bunch of horrific acts. He instilled a sense of blind loyalty amongst his disciples, using mind control techniques to exert complete control over their thoughts, actions. But under his direction, Aum Shinrikyo carried out a series of violent acts, including, of course, the infamous Tokyo subway sarin gas attack in 1995 that resulted in the deaths of 13 people and injured thousands. The act was planned to just be the tip of the iceberg, too, in the extreme measures they were going to use to fulfill their goals. Asahara claimed to prophesize this apocalyptic vision and believed in imminent global destruction, leading his followers to stockpile weapons and engage in activities aimed at kind of destabilizing society. He had this complete disregard for human life and was willing to harm others to fulfill his ambitions. He even made a statement about how disappointed with what he saw as a low death toll in the 1995 subway attacks. And finally, we have the Anthill Kids. The Anthill Kids was a cult led by Roch Thériault in 1977. The group was based in Canada and followed a pretty twisted belief system. Essentially, they were a doomsday cult, but Thériault's charismatic manipulation led his followers to believe he possessed divine powers and that with his help, they would be the sole survivors of this coming apocalypse. Pretty standard cult stuff, but man, this is the worst cult I've ever read about. It's really gross. Can't talk about most of it on here, but anyway. Under his influence, the cult members isolated themselves from the outside world, creating a closed, kind of secretive community on a mountainside that their divine leader didn't even help them build. He just kind of sat back and watched. And behind this facade of spiritual enlightenment, Thériault subjected his followers to severe physical and psychological mistreatment. He enforced strict and incredibly bizarre rules on them, and he started becoming increasingly more erratic in his behavior. His true nature came out in acts of violence and control, inflicting harm on his followers in the name of discipline and purification. Some members endured severe physical torture, including beatings. They'd have amputations done on them. This guy claimed he had magical powers that would allow him to reattach his followers' body parts, and his reign of terror eventually led to the death of one of his many wives, and he was eventually arrested but received an incredibly light sentence because it's Canada, and wouldn't you know it, he went back to doing the exact same crap before being arrested again, and years later a fellow inmate put an end to him for good.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have John George High. John George High, commonly referred to as the acid bath killer, was an infamous English serial killer who operated in the 1940s. His gruesome crimes shocked the nation and earned him a chilling reputation for his method of disposing of the victims' bodies, which involved dissolving them in sulfuric acid. His victims included both men and women whom he targeted for their money and possessions. High would befriend his victims, gaining their trust before luring them to his place of work, a warehouse located in Crawley, West Sussex. High believed that if there were no physical remains, the police would have no evidence of his crimes. However, his assumption proved to be flawed. What a shocker. Police investigators found that while the acid effectively destroyed most of the victims' bodies, certain remains such as dentures, bone fragments, and other non-organic materials were resistant to the corrosive effects. Eventually, High's crimes caught up with him. In 1949, he was arrested for the killing of a wealthy man named Archibald Henderson, whose disappearance had raised suspicions. During his interrogation, High confessed not only to killing Henderson, but also several other individuals. At his trial, High's sanity became a significant point of contention. He claimed that he was driven by a compulsion to drink human blood and that he believed he could turn his victims' bodies into sludge, allowing him to absorb their wealth. Despite these claims, the court found High guilty and he was sentenced to death. On August 10, 1949, John George High was executed by hanging at Wandsworth Prison in London. In our number 9 spot today, we have Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez. Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez, notorious as the Lonely Hearts Killers, were a criminal couple who operated in the late 1940s. Using various aliases and personas, Fernandez would respond to Lonely Hearts ads placed by women seeking love or companionship. He would pose as a charming, attractive man, enticing these women into romantic relationships. Beck, playing the role of Fernandez's sister or relative, would eventually join the relationship, gaining the trust of the victims. Once the couple had gained the woman's trust and manipulated them emotionally, they would proceed to rob them of their money, possessions, and even their personal savings. In some cases, the victims' bank accounts would be emptied and their properties sold off. As their greed and desperation increased, the couple turned to killing in order to eliminate any potential witnesses who could expose their criminal activities. Their crimes eventually caught up with them when they targeted a widow named Janet Fay in 1949. Fay's sister became suspicious of Fernandez's intentions and alerted the authorities. The couple was apprehended in Michigan and extradited to New York for trial. During the trial, Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez confessed to multiple crimes. Both Beck and Fernandez were found guilty and sentenced to death. On March 8, 1951, Martha Beck was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. Raymond Fernandez met the same fate on the same day. In our number 8 spot today, we have Charles Sabraj. Infamously known as the Bikini Killer or the Serpent, was a serial killer active during the 1970s who targeted and preyed upon Western tourists traveling through South Asia. He would approach them, often posing as a gem dealer or an official, guiding them through the region. Once he had gained their trust, he would employ various methods to incapacitate and then take the life of his victims. These methods included poisoning, using intoxicating substances, and sometimes even more violent physical methods. He would then rob them of their belongings, including money, passports, and any valuable possessions. Despite being arrested multiple times, he demonstrated remarkable skills in manipulating the legal systems of various countries. He often managed to escape from custody either through bribery, forging documents, or exploiting legal loopholes. However, his luck eventually ran out. In 1976, while attempting to poison a group of French students in New Delhi, he was arrested by authorities. In 1977, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in India. Over the years, he faced additional legal troubles in countries like Thailand and Nepal, which further extended his time behind bars. In our number 7 spot today, we have Gary Heidnik. This is a name you might be more familiar with than some of the others on this list, and that is because this is the man who inspired the character of Buffalo Bill in the infamous novel Silence of the Lambs. If you're familiar with the literature, you'll know that that's absolutely not a good sign. Gary Heidnik was an American serial killer who committed heinous crimes in the late 1980s. Heidnik kidnapped and tormented 6 women, imprisoning them in his home. He would lure them into his home under false pretenses, offering food, shelter, or something else that they needed or wanted. Once inside, he subjected them to unimaginable horrors, imprisoning them in a pit dug in the basement of his house, which was later named the Pit of Horrors. Of course, I cannot detail much more of his crimes in order to stay within the guidelines of YouTube, but it's safe to say it was absolutely horrendous. Tragically, 2 of Heidnik's victims did not survive the ordeal. The remains of Deborah Dudley and Sandra Lindsay were discovered in Heidnik's basement, leading to his arrest in March 1987. The remaining 4 women were rescued and provided critical testimony against him. During his trial, Heidnik's disturbing and psychopathic behavior became very apparent. He displayed no remorse for his actions and even attempted to act as his own attorney. His behavior and erratic courtroom antics added to the shock and horror surrounding the case. Ultimately, he was found guilty of multiple counts of killing and many other charges as well. He was sentenced to death and spent several years on death row while his case went through numerous appeals. On July 6, 1999, Gary Heidnik was executed by lethal injection at the State Correctional Institute in Rockview, Pennsylvania. In our number 6 spot today, we have Yang Xinhai. Yang, also known as the Monster Killer, was one of the most prolific serial killers in China's history. Active from 1999 to 2003, he terrorized multiple provinces by taking the lives of his victims, often targeting entire families. Yang's heinous crimes shocked the nation and left a lasting impact on Chinese society. In 1988, at the age of 20, Yang embarked on his life of crime. He was arrested and imprisoned for a series of burglaries, spending time in a labor camp. Following his release in 1999, he began a spree of violence that would terrify communities throughout China. Yang's MO involved breaking into houses during the night, often in rural areas where security was relatively lax. He would then kill the occupants, and he showed no mercy
mercy or remorse. The brutality and frequency of Yang's crimes were unprecedented in China. He showed a complete disregard for human life, often leaving behind scenes of extreme violence and horror. Despite the high number of killings, Yang managed to evade capture for several years. However, in November 2003, Yang's killing spree came to an end. During a routine police inspection, he was caught in the act of committing a burglary. When questioned by the police, Yang confessed. During his trial, he showed no remorse for his actions and appeared detached from the gravity of his crimes. He was found guilty, and in February 2004, Yang was sentenced to death and executed soon after. In our number 5 spot today, we have Pedro Rodrigues Fliho. Also known as the Padrino Matador, he is a Brazilian serial killer who is believed to have killed over 70 people, mostly other criminals, in the 1960s and 1970s. Pedro had a difficult childhood as his father was a notorious criminal who actually really sadly harmed and killed his mother. This of course had a profound influence on Pedro and his life. This experience is believed to have contributed to his violent behavior later on. Pedro began his crime spree at a super young age, and he started with a horrific crime when he killed the vice mayor of his town, who he believed was responsible for the death of his girlfriend. He continued to kill other criminals, often targeting those who had previously wronged him or his family. Pedro was arrested in 1973 and was eventually convicted of killing 71 people. Although he was sentenced to 400 years, there was a maximum time of 30 years, which Pedro served before being released in 2007. Pedro himself passed away earlier this year in March after being killed by 2 still unknown suspects. In our number 4 spot today, we have Karl Panzram. Karl Panzram was a notorious criminal and serial killer who committed a wide range of heinous acts during the early 20th century. In his own written account, Panzram claimed responsibility for 21 killings and thousands of burglaries. Throughout his criminal career, he traveled extensively, committing a slew of violent crimes along the way. This geographical dispersion made it difficult for law enforcement to connect his crimes and build a comprehensive profile of his actions. He targeted individuals who he perceived as easy victims, often taking advantage of their vulnerability or luring them into isolated areas. In 1928, Panzram was apprehended and arrested for burglary. While in prison, he authored an autobiography in which he provided a chilling first-hand account of his crimes and his deeply antisocial mindset. Panzram's writings offered a disturbing glimpse into the mind of a remorseless and violent individual. On September 5, 1930, Panzram was executed by hanging at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. His execution marked the end of his violent reign, but his written confessions and personal accounts continue to fascinate and disturb those interested in the psychology of criminal behavior. In our number 3 spot today, we have Stephen Richards. Stephen Richards, also known by his alias Captain Moonlight, is a notorious figure in Australian criminal history. Before adopting his criminal persona, Richards pursued a career as a lay preacher in the Anglican Church. However, his actions were not in line with his religious calling. He engaged in fraudulent activities, including embezzlement and insurance scams, which led to his imprisonment in 1869. During his time in prison, Richards met another criminal named Jesse Nesbitt, and together they formed a bond. Upon their release in 1874, Richards and Nesbitt began leading a gang that engaged in robberies and confrontations with law enforcement. Richards adopted the moniker Captain Moonlight as his alias, and his charismatic personality garnered attention from both the public and the media. He cultivated an image of a romanticized outlaw, drawing inspiration from the legends of American Old West figures like Jesse James and Ned Kelly. In 1879, the gang attempted to rob a bank in New South Wales, resulting in a violent shootout. Several members of the gang, including Nesbitt, were killed, and Richards was captured along with the remaining members. Following their capture, Richards and his surviving gang members were put on trial for killing. The prosecution argued that Richards had ordered the shooting of a police officer during the failed bank robbery. Despite his claims of innocence, Richards was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. In the early morning hours of January 20th, 1880, Stephen Richards met his fate on the gallows at Darlinghurst Gaol in Sydney. In our number 2 spot today, we have Thomas Neill Cream. What a horrible name. So bad. Thomas Cream, dubbed the Lambeth Poisoner, was a Scottish-Canadian doctor who gained notoriety for his terrifying activities during the late 19th century. Cream's preferred method of killing was poisoning, and he targeted his victims, particularly women with whom he had been romantically involved. His crime spree started to crumble after the death of a woman named Matilda Clover, who had been his lover. Suspicion arose regarding her sudden demise, and an investigation was launched, and evidence pointed toward Cream's involvement. However, lacking concrete proof, authorities were unable to bring charges against him. Cream, undeterred, continued his killing spree, but his luck would soon run out. In 1892, Cream's crimes were exposed when he implicated himself in a series of poisonings in a bid to frame others for the killings. His actions drew attention, leading to his arrest and subsequent trial. During the trial, Cream made several erratic outbursts, including accusing others of being the true culprits, but to no avail. In October 1892, Thomas Neill Cream was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. On November 15, 1892, he met his fate at Newgate Prison in London. In our number 1 spot today, we have Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei, infamously known as the Butcher of Rostov, was a Soviet serial killer who terrorized Russia for over a decade. Operating between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo was responsible for taking the lives of at least 53 people, predominantly young and vulnerable individuals. His MO typically involved approaching his victims under the pretense of offering assistance, promising them employment or personal favors. Once he gained their trust, he would then lead them to a secluded location where the horrors would take place. In 1990, his crimes were finally brought to an end. A series of coincidences and the persistence of an investigator named Viktor Burakov led to his identification and subsequent arrest. Despite his initial denial of the crimes, DNA evidence eventually linked him to them, leading to his confession. During his trial in 1992, he was found guilty of 53 killings, although he later claimed to have killed more than 100 victims. Chikatilo was sentenced to death and executed on February 14, 1994.